Welcome to the Lean and Agile Thinking for NGOs and Nonprofits interview series. I'm Steve Bell. During this series, we'll hear from thought leaders across the Lean and Agile communities, and we'll hear from people working with NGOs and nonprofit organizations around the world, sharing their experiences and lessons learned as they practice continuous improvement, innovation, and learning. We'll focus on how to do the right things, doing them in the right way, by asking the right questions to help us address the challenges and opportunities facing our future generations. Today we have two guests. First, Dr. Jeffrey Leiker is going to help us understand the fundamental principles and practices behind what we often call lean leadership. Then, Dr. Andrew Parris will help us understand a variety of challenges facing NGOs and nonprofits in today's fast-paced, often chaotic world. Then together, we'll explore how lean leadership might help NGOs and nonprofits, acting both globally and locally, become more effective. Let's meet our guests. Dr. Jeffrey Leiker is Professor Emeritus of Industrial and Operations Engineering at the University of Michigan. For over 20 years, he has been invited deep inside Toyota's global operations, where he has cultivated a unique and intimate understanding of what has made and still makes Toyota special, and why it became the foundation of the global lean movement. Jeff authored the Toyota Way series, often with prominent co-authors from inside Toyota. He has been awarded 13 Shingo Prizes for research excellence, and in 2012 he was inducted into the Association of Manufacturing Excellence Hall of Fame. I have known Jeff for over 20 years. I consider him my first mentor in the lean community, though I don't think he knew it at the time, as he supported me in the development of my first book. I'm grateful for his generosity, guidance, and patience. What I find most interesting about Jeff is that despite his expertise in manufacturing and business management, he earned his PhD as a sociologist and emphasizes the human element of Toyota as the key to their success and longevity. Welcome, Jeff. I'm so glad to have you here. Dr. Andrew Parris directs process excellence efforts at Medair, a Swiss Humanitarian Aid organization. He's also an education partner with ETH Zurich, a Swiss higher education institution, in their Humanitarian Operations and Supply Chain Management Lab, applying scientific research to many of the largest humanitarian supply chains around the globe. Andrew has many talents. With a PhD in engineering from MIT, he was an early adopter of Lean as part of MIT's then fledgling Lean Aerospace program. He's a rigorous researcher, experimenter, practitioner, teacher, and coach. He's also a prolific and talented writer with the ability to communicate complex topics in the boardroom and on the front lines in remote areas of the world. He has a wealth of experience with the daily challenges of running and continuously improving humanitarian aid programs at both the global and the local level. Andrew has been a strong supporter of lean and agile thinking for NGOs and nonprofits since I founded it 12 years ago, and I often turn to him for input and guidance. Thanks for your patience with that, Andrew. I'm delighted that you could take time away from your work, travel, writing, and your family to be with us today. This interview is presented in 5 chapters as separate videos that can be watched independently. First, Jeff describes the foundations of Toyota Way and lean practice. In Chapter 2, Andrew introduces the challenges of adopting lean practice in the NGO world. In Chapter 3, we discuss particular challenges including high turnover, high variation, and risk that NGOs face in the field. In Chapter 4, we discuss issues of measuring activity and outcomes and the importance of these to philanthropic funders. And in Chapter 5, we discuss approaches that leaders and frontline workers may take to learning, establishing confidence in, and deploying lean practice. So let's begin. Well, welcome, Jeff. Welcome, Andrew. So pleased to have you both here. I'd like to get right started with a question, and this one's for Jeff. Jeff, when people hear the term lean, they may think it has something either to do with being thin or having too few people, and thus somehow weakened, or they may associate it with the phrase lean and mean. And none of these really accurately capture the spirit of what we're talking about. So what should people think of when they hear the term lean?
Sometimes I distinguish between lean with a small L, little lean, and big lean with a capital L. And the big lean is using Toyota as a model. And for Toyota, what we're calling lean is really their way and their whole management system. And in the Toyota way, which is now in the second edition, I have a model that I call the 4P model, just for simplicity. And it starts with philosophy. Why do you exist? What is your purpose? What does success look like? What is your vision for success? Then processes. What are the processes by which you're going to achieve that vision? And that's where lean often gets stuck, in improving processes, particularly in private companies, for efficiency and productivity in order to reduce costs, usually by eliminating workers. But for Toyota, the processes are designed for the best value to the customer, which means get the customer what they want when they want it with high quality and at low cost. And the way they do that is through people who are being trained and developed and are part of the team long term and have the skills of continuous improvement, which is basically problem solving. That's the fourth P, which is that when you see a problem, when you make a mistake, when things don't work out as you expect, you can get quick feedback and learn from that, and then try again better. And learn from your mistakes, learn from your successes, and over time become a true learning organization. And in this latest version of the Toyota Way, the newer version, I put in the center scientific thinking, and that's really what is the core of the culture at Toyota. By scientific thinking, I mean that you have a clear goal that you could state in usually quantitative terms. These are our measures, not necessarily generic measures, but these are right now our measures of success on the way to our vision. And then you study the current condition and you have an honest and accurate view of what's happening now, your strengths and your weaknesses. And then you start to experiment. So when you have an idea, you don't assume that it's going to work because you know you're always right, but rather you assume that it may not work, that until you've tested it, it's just an idea, a hypothesis, like a scientist. So you think of what you do not as implementing solutions, but instead at running experiments. Not like big experiments once a year, but experiments every day. You're constantly trying things, looking at the results compared to what you expected, and then making adjustments and running the next experiment, the next experiment. Toyota refers to that as plan, do, check, act, after Dr. W. Edwards Deming. And they have a plan, which is the hypothesis, and they do something, and then they check what happens, and then the final step is to reflect on what you've learned. So they're constantly doing PDCA at all levels of the organization. The front line, the support staff, the executives are all doing PDCA all the time.
Okay. Well, I'm reflecting on what you've just said, and I'm also reflecting on what has been a rather illustrious and prolific career. And you really are recognized as the authority on Toyota. You've seen so much, so intimate for so long. And the lean movement that's gone around the globe for the last 20 years or so seems to have settled, at least many in the consulting world, around more the focus on the tools and the methods. But Toyota has had over 50-year run, an amazing run, and they're still going as conditions change. And it seems like oftentimes when we see what tools and methods Toyota is using, we're looking 5-10 years in the rearview mirror while Toyota is moving on. So there's got to be something more to it than that. And I think you planted some seeds in what you just said. So after as many decades as you've spent looking at Toyota and translating their practices for the rest of us, what is it that has you most excited about what you've learned?
And when I started learning about industrial organization, I was an undergraduate industrial engineer. This was in the early 70s. And I went into industrial engineering because they talked about the integration of people and technology, and the human side really interested me. But then the technical side really was so I can get a job. And what I discovered was that like 98% of the program was on the technical side. It was just tools of various kinds, which didn't particularly interest me. I could see that they're useful, but in order to get the social side, I took a bunch of courses in the sociology department. And what I became interested in kind of on my own was what's called socio-technical systems, which goes back to systems theory, and the idea is that you integrate the technical system and the social system, and you come up with a form of organization that maximizes the benefits of both. As I studied it, one of the things I really liked is that there was a big focus on teamwork and in all the solutions to the problems. And I happened to work for a company, General Foods at the time, that had dog food plants. One was in Kankakee, Illinois, and they were following socio-technical systems. So I got to see what they were doing. And they had created autonomous groups of workers who ran every stage of making the dog food. And they were in control, and they taught them communication skills, and they taught them to work effectively as a team. And they didn't have to go to some other department and go through bureaucracy to make decisions. They could make decisions very quickly. So I was very impressed by that. But what I noticed was that all they really were doing was manipulating the social system. So supposedly it was socio-technical, but it was really social. And I got to the point where I was sort of a little disenchanted. And then when I got a PhD in sociology along the way, and I ended up as a professor of industrial engineering of all things at University of Michigan in 1982. And I was asked to join a project to look at a comparison between US and Japan auto manufacturing. And suddenly I discovered, without expecting it, that Toyota really had developed a true socio-technical system. And they called it the Toyota Production System. And if you look at the tools of TPS from Toyota's point of view, the tools actually facilitate people developing and problem solving. For example, one thing that's very popular is that they use something called Kanban, which are cards. And the worker says, I'm running out of parts, mails the card back, I'm ready for more, and then they bring them more parts. And they can orchestrate thousands of parts. They used to do it all with cards. Now they use computers. And that was always fascinating. But the main point of doing that was to have a clear standard that I don't ask for parts until I get down to one bin. And then the parts come in a certain amount of time. And the parts should come with a physical Kanban on them that I could see whether it's on it or not. And all these standards allow me to tell whether I'm in control or out of control. And the worker and the material handler know something's wrong. I've got a container without a card. Or I got there 3 minutes late. And it's very clear and visible, which then allows them to continually improve, to see the gap between the actual and the standard, and then look every day at where things have gone wrong, because things always go wrong, and then make improvements. So the tool itself was really putting control in the hands of the worker to order their own parts and create a system where you could see when things needed to be improved. It was facilitating the social system. So that was, to me, really socio-technical.
Yeah.
And then I haven't seen many cases since that are as sophisticated in really combining the social and technical. And then we studied product development and found the same sorts of things.
Yeah.
And we studied the way they set up dealerships, the way they intend to set up dealerships. They don't always work that way when they're private businesses, and in every aspect of the company, information technology, there's now a movement of lean and agile software development. In every case, there's a technical system that gives you the standard way you should do it, then a way of very clearly visualizing, it could be Post-it notes, very clearly visualizing I'm out of standard, which then leads to problem solving and improvement.
Yeah. Interesting that you bring up Kanban because nowadays, if you go inside any software development organization in the world, you're likely to see on the walls big sheets of paper and sticky notes, and they call them Kanban. And that came from original Toyota, whether they're using software to do their Kanbans or whether they're using sticky notes and sheets of paper. But it's interesting to remember that back in the 50s, when Toyota originally developed that practice, that was just as business computing was emerging. So it was pre-computer. These cards were actually running factories. So to your point, they were more socio than technical in that they were little cards flying around factories. And that has always astonished me.
Well, the key behind it is what Toyota calls visual management, where they believe that as humans, we respond better to visuals than to verbal commands or even seeing information on a computer. And when you're making quick decisions in a mass production environment, you don't have time to study a manual or pull up the right computer screen. You have to be able to see instantly, like a traffic light. I use a traffic light as an example. I need to stop, go, or start to slow down. And I don't have to analyze it or evaluate it. So most of their signals are binary or green, yellow, red. And it's to give you a very quick picture of when you're in standard, when you're out of standard. If you're out of standard, take note and maybe come back later and solve the problem.
That's interesting because in a factory, even a Toyota factory, there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of visual distraction. So making these signals clear because there's a lot of change. So I have one more question for you, Jeff, and Andrew's waiting patiently. And believe me, we're about to bring you in, Andrew. But the next question I want to ask Jeff is going to set up for you to join in. And you mentioned you joined on the faculty at U of M in 1982. I graduated in Ann Arbor in 82. I was on the main campus. You were on North Campus, never met. It was years before I even heard of this thing called Lean. But I do remember many of my classmates were sons and daughters of Detroit auto executives and auto workers at that time. And I heard firsthand the stories of what was going on in those plants and what was going on in the management. And it was around that time that Chrysler had to be worked out of bankruptcy. And a couple of decades later, the US had to bail out General Motors. The US was in decline, their auto industry, the business model, and the assumptions weren't working anymore. And as a result, much of what you came up with in your early studies, we recognized Toyota was not just pulling ahead, but they were creating a gap that no one was able to catch up with for years. And the only way others did catch up was by modeling themselves after what Toyota did. So there was something more remarkable there than just how they made automobiles. And as we start to bridge the gap to hand this over to Andrew in the world of NGO, just help us understand the fundamental mindset that was going on that you saw in those early years.
Okay, so in the model, again, I mentioned the 4P model, and philosophy is the first P, and I call it long-term systems thinking. So what that meant for Toyota is that they had a vision of what they were trying to achieve, being a leader in certain segments of the automobile industry, and they had an image of what customers wanted. And they actually planned out several generations of vehicles in advance. And then they were working toward that vision. They also had a vision for the enterprise. For example, it revolves around continuous improvement and respect for people, those two things, and what that looked like and they wanted to achieve that. So a lot of the small activities they were taking on a day-to-day basis were driven by that long-term vision. Part of the long-term vision is that they believe they need to develop people for the long term, to think somewhat differently. I mentioned scientific thinking. So to have the skills to improve, to have the skills to relentlessly work toward goals without giving up. They call it persistence. So there's a certain type of person who it gets socialized into becoming a Toyota leader. and they needed those people. And therefore, they were willing to make really large investments in developing people. And but they always had that vision. Now, in the American auto companies, their vision was make money, satisfy shareholders. They're under the CEOs are under pressure every quarter to report on their progress and what they're going to do to push the stock price up. And then, by the way, we've had some quality issues, so we have a quality initiative, and we need to improve our productivity. So we have a lean initiative to take labor out, and maybe some inventory that might be helpful to not have cash tied up in inventory. So their drivers were all very short term, very specific outcomes. And they became convinced that if they plug in these tools, they ought to be able to get, as a result, these outcomes. It's the opposite of systems thinking. It's simple cause and effect. I turn this lever, I get this result, or something's wrong, or somebody screwed up, and then we find the guilty party. So that was the mindset and the culture. So and I was involved with Ford in the early days when they created what they called the Ford Production System, which was modeled after Toyota, which is based on these studies at MIT and Michigan comparing Japanese companies to American companies. And the one thing that they could control was to use the tools, with the assumption that if I use the tool that Toyota's using, I'm going to get the results that Toyota got. And what they're looking at was the technical system completely. And they're completely missing the social system. And then it realized how Toyota was using these tools to develop people. And really, the purpose of the tool was to give information in real time to the people so that they could solve problems and improve. But the American car companies missed that. And then when they introduced the tools, they didn't get immediate big results. They would abandon them.
Yeah.
And over time, they kept on trying to go back up the hill. So the Ford Production System died and was reborn probably a half dozen times. And they're trying to rebirth it right now. And this is almost 40 years later. And General Motors actually, at the point they went bankrupt, were probably the best they'd ever been in their factories.
Yeah.
But what they're missing is that it's a whole company. It's not just a manufacturing company. They have to design vehicles people want and engineer them and design and build in quality. So there's a whole life cycle for a vehicle. And frankly, they just had vehicles that people didn't want, no matter how well built they were. So and they would tend also, I use the analogy of Toyota being like the tortoise, and these companies are like the hare. So they're running like crazy to get results and satisfy their stockholders, and then they hit a wall, and then they're near bankrupt, and then they're laying off people massively, which they're doing right now. And then they hire a bunch of new people, and they go running up the hill again until they fall down again. So it's like, it's like this. In the meantime, Toyota's doing this, always driven by that long-term vision.